The repair method is beyond imagination. In order to repair the damaged front axle of the truck, the Pakistani technicians must have spent a lot of effort. The man in front of us, who is in Pakistan where it is difficult to find spare parts, simply came to the ancient repair shop for repair. At this time, the other half of the broken part can no longer be found. It undoubtedly increases the difficulty of repair, but it does not stump the repair master with superb memory. First, the master has to use the notch to cut the broken surface so that it can facilitate the subsequent splicing process. After both sides are cut, the angle grinder is used for detailed grinding. The crack is smoother since the other side of the kingpin can no longer be found. The smart repair master is ready to use this steel pipe for splicing. First, he uses a caliper. Then he can fix the steel pipe on the lathe and use the lathe tool to cut the length of the steel pipe. After cutting the required length, the inner mirror needs to be cut for the subsequent installation of the main cutting. This cutting process is very difficult for the experienced glasses uncle. It is undoubtedly a piece of cake for Jong Fei to eat bean sprouts. The size of the steel pipe has been cut very quickly. It is not so easy to connect this steel pipe to the broken main cutting hole. First, you need to use the main cutting as a positioning, and then use steel paper to draw marks on the steel pipe. The purpose is to cut the steel pipe into two halves. Ensure that there is no problem with the gap and angle when splicing with the front axle. The steel pipe that has been drawn is now cut into two halves very quickly by the master with skilled operation. Next, the master can splice it to the front axle. In order to prevent the gap of the kingpin hole from deviating, Fu flexibly uses the kingpin as a support and then uses electric welding for simple welding. Because the angle of the kingpin hole is related to the front vertical of the truck, the master needs to use a caliper to carefully measure the front axle and use the intact side as a comparison. The fine trimming ensures that there is no problem. After completing this step, the master can then carefully weld the splicing to prevent subsequent cracking. The welding process needs to be very careful. Exquisite master. It is definitely not enough to just use simple welding. The master must first grind the welding surface flat and then use the iron plate to reinforce the joint. The reinforcement process also only needs to use electric welding and iron plate welding to fix it firmly. After a series of extremely white-faced operations, the cracked front axle kingpin hole was finally repaired. This is because after welding, the matching clearance between the pin and the kingpin hole has deviated. Therefore, the master needs to directly install a bushing inside the kingpin hole. It is not that simple because they do not have a high-end hole laying machine. The master has the ingenuity to directly use ordinary lathes for processing. In order to achieve this difficult processing procedure, the masters first need to simply fix one end of the front axle. Then, in order to facilitate the movement of the front axle, the masters need to weld a movable bracket on this side. In order to control the movement of the front axle, the tool holder of the bed is directly welded to the front axle with a piece of steel plate. After the lathe chuck is fixed on the lying rod, when the inner diameter of the main axle hole of the front axle is cut, the process is relatively simple. The master only needs to strictly control the lathe and observe the cutting situation carefully. Gradually cut the hole to the appropriate position and then take a photo. After a series of extreme white face processing, the axle has been cut. Then the inner diameter size can be used to make up the gap. The bushing, which is used to make up the gap, is cut. After the outer seam is gradually cut to the appropriate size, the inner seam is finely drilled. In the process, you need to be very careful to prevent the inner diameter and the kingpin from having problems. After a series of extreme white face processing, the bushing has been processed. Next, you can use a small hammer to knock it 4 times and gradually install the bushing inside the kingpin hole. The master progresses neither fast nor slow in the process. It takes about 31 knocks to install the bushing to prevent the bushing from being stuck. The parts need to be welded with electric welding and then finally polished with a grinding machine. The deviation affects the front number of the truck. At this time, the front axle with a broken kingpin hole has finally been repaired. What do you think of the repair method of the master? If it is out of 10, how many points are you willing to give?